weeks away, a week in Tampa, and Norwich City have returned to league action with a victory away at Swansea. It was a bitterly cold afternoon in South Wales as well. We're going to reflect on it here in the latest edition of the PinkUn.com Norwich City podcast. I'm your host, Connor Southwell, joined by Paddy, Davitt and Seaman to talk or pick the bones out of yesterday's victory over Russell Martin's side. Pad, we've all had a little bit of a refresh. Probably everyone needed a little bit of a break away from the way the championship season for Norwich City was transpiring. But what are your reflections on yesterday? I think maybe the common consensus seems to be a very positive result, but a performance that probably remains somewhat unconvincing. But does that necessarily matter given the run of form that Norwich were on, obviously, before they went into this World Cup break?
Well, I mean, ultimately, it is a results-driven business, and a away win with a clean sheet is not to be sniffed at. So, on that measure, it was job done. But unfortunately, it's not one game in isolation. It's kind of the 22nd game in a season, which has been fairly, underwhelming. Certainly, large periods of turbulence in terms of that lack of consistency in results and performances. They're coming off the back of, a rather toxic defeat to Middlesbrough at Carrow Road. And, the talk in between was about resets and different animals. And yes, they got the result. Full credit to them. But I don't think it felt like a reset to me. So, that nagging doubt that it was more of the same. And I think they were fortunate to encounter a Swansea who, as pleasing as they are on the eye, they were very toothless and they could have played till midnight, and I don't think they'd have breached Angus Gunn's goal. So a different, more potent championship rival with that weight of possession and territory might have been a different outcome. Or, as I've written about today, if Russell Martin could have lent to Pukki, Sargent, maybe even Adamida, it might have been a different outcome. Because Perot, their main man, he's definitely gone off the boil compared to last season. So you can't argue with the result. Dean Smith has got the result. He was happy with the aspects without the ball, which was what he flagged up after Middlesbrough, but conversely with the ball. Certainly in the second half. I thought first half they did a very good containment job, but they had a counter-attacking threat. 2 or 3 very good opportunities on the counter. But second half, far too passive, very inhibited. Dean Smith post-match talking about maybe it was that protection mode of we've got a lead, we'll hold on to it, rather than going on the front foot and trying to get a second, the third goal and kill the game. And maybe that's a reflection of the lack of self-confidence and self-belief in terms of results and performances. But there wasn't enough in that 90 minutes to feel that it was anything different. And the fear is, of course, that if we're still in the same cycle, then it's going to be followed by more patchy results and performances. And with 3 of the next 4 at Carrow Road, just in terms of the mood, I don't think that would be a very good turn of events if we're still scratching our heads and wondering, why can't this head coach get the most out of this group of players or more out of this group of players? So, we won't take it away. They got a result and it was badly needed. But in terms of the performances that we've seen to this point, it was more of the same for me.
Yeah, I would concur. It feels, and I said this in my verdict, it's a very hard result to analyse in isolation because, again, once again you find it difficult to back it up with real evidence that there was a real shift in terms of performance. But equally, and as Dean Smith and as you put to Dean Smith post-match, you could also frame it that it could be somewhat of a building block if they were then able to go and build on it. But then we've been at this sort of junction before this season and that hasn't happened. And I mean, just to kind of talk about what you said there in terms of the second half performance, I've got all of Norwich City's shots in front of me. They had 5 yesterday. 3 of them came within the minutes, and they did call a single shot, not target, a single shot after the 30th burst. So, Sam, once again, it's very difficult to suggest kind of that we saw any kind of different animal or that there was a real tangible step forward. And possibly, as Paddy discussed there, it was maybe a victory owed to what Swansea City were unable to do rather than perhaps what Norwich City did do.
Yeah, I suppose so. But I think that game state that Paddy referenced in terms of Norwich scoring, obviously in the opening minute, perhaps does give Dean Smith a little bit of an explanation as to why it wasn't the most proactive performance. You look at those stats, and in my match report, I always update those as sort of things go on. And actually, a lot of those shots were sort of the last 10, 15 minutes. So I'm not trying to excuse a performance that I think was not exactly what a team with the squad that Norwich City have would like to produce. But I think there are certainly mitigating circumstances that there perhaps haven't been at other times in the season. But it was the sort of game we were forecasting going into it. Swansea did dominate possession and they did dominate the chances. And I suppose Dean Smith would look at that as the ultimate sort of pragmatist and say, well, he's got his game plan spot on in that case, because Swansea play like that every game and Norwich have gone there to counter-attack, and Russell Martin actually praised their ability to do that following the game. So I think there are certain elements of that Dean Smith will be pleased with. He actually said post-match that sort of 1-0 is his favourite scoreline, and in that case he'll be very pleased with what they've done. But within the context of how the season's already gone, that's where the problem lies. And I was speaking to some fans after the game yesterday, and I actually said to them, if this was part of a Daniel Farke season, do you think you'd be looking at it as a very positive result? And they said, actually, if it was part of a Daniel Farke season, we'd be loving it, because it would be something different and it would be the ability to grind out results. But I don't think these Norwich fans, who were made to, who've been starved of good football for a number of years, given that COVID break took out their last championship title, are particularly content to be sitting in fourth and producing football that isn't really entertaining for anyone to watch. And I felt in that case, maybe that's where you criticise Dean Smith and his setup yesterday. Josh Sargent, the last time I spoke to him, also said that he felt Norwich, when they go 1-0 up, need to have a more positive mentality. Now, in South Wales, obviously, that mentality and that defensive will actually got them the result in the end. So it's hard to criticise them, solely based on yesterday. But if you're looking at it as a problem across the season of them going 1-0 up and then not having the right mentality when that happens, then you'd think there's probably going to be a few situations, as there already has been, where they sit on a lead a little bit too much, and you'd like to see signs of that proactivity going forward. I don't think, as I've referenced, Dean Smith will be particularly happy with too many criticisms of a result that probably a lot of Norwich fans would have seen as a very good one going into the game, but wrapped around the context of how the season's been so far and the performances we've been subjected to, I don't think Norwich fans are particularly focused on results. I think they're looking to the midterm and also to the entertainment that they seek, and they haven't really seen too many good signs on either of those fronts, unfortunately.
And I guess there's an element, and just to kind of poke that old debate again, that there's been proof this season that actually their performances have eventually married up with results. So even when there is a result like this, if the performance behind it isn't necessarily great, well, the evidence that's gone before suggests that that's going to even itself out, which is probably why there's still a lot of frustration, even though Norwich City managed to win the game. But, I spoke to Ben Gibson afterwards, and he kind of admitted that the players felt that the performance wasn't particularly great. I think Isaac Hayden basically tweeted that it wasn't pretty, and it really wasn't. But given where they were, Pad, before the break, and that Middlesbrough defeat and everything that's around it, and the noise that's gone on throughout the break over Dean Smith, his setup, the direction of travel that Norwich City are going in, it probably felt like a result was of primary importance. It probably felt that this was a kind of game that they needed, and one that is certainly able or should be able, hopefully, to inject some confidence into a team that's looked pretty short of it in recent weeks.
Yeah, all that is true, but as I said in my first remarks, my concern now is that they return to Carrow Road and 3 of the next 4 in the league are at home, and they're just unable so far to come up with a formula at home that would take that solidity that we saw at Swansea, and that was the commendable element of that win on Saturday, but around that, going forward, far more cohesive, far more confident, ideally dominating the ball as well, but putting teams on the back foot, and to take Sam's point, like Middlesbrough, the last game at home, get up very early and then don't go for the jugular, put 2 or 3 other goals in, and that game is done by the final quarter of an hour, rather than, as it turned out, it was a a rather sad twist in terms of Middlesbrough coming back and scoring the 2 goals. So my real concern is that, if they can't change the narrative at Carrow Road, then three games out of 4 at Carrow Road should be a platform to really catapult themselves back into the front rank, i.e. the Burnleys and the Sheffield Uniteds, maybe even the Watfords now. But if it goes the other way, and it's more of what we saw against Middlesbrough, I mean, the last 5 games at Carrow Road in the league, 1 win. That's a team fighting for survival at the wrong end of the table, not a team going for promotion. If they can't change that, and underpinning that is if they can't change the way they set about teams at Carrow Road, with and without the ball, then very swiftly, I think it's going to get pretty toxic, because ultimately, and Dean Smith would be the first to tell you this, any team who harbours any realistic ambitions of promotion, they have to have a good record at home. They have to be strong at home. I mean, away from home, that I don't think you look at the wins they've got on the board. I think I looked earlier, they've got 5 away wins now. I think only Burnley and Sheffield United, off the top of my head, have got more away wins. So, irrespective of the performances, I think away from home, they've got something going there that they can residually pick up points. But at Carrow Road, it's a different affair entirely, and that's why for me, it's almost a holding pattern. What we saw at Swansea is kind of what we've seen. Blackpool, that springs to mind. That was a 1-0 dogged away performance.
Sunderland as well.
Yeah, exactly. Didn't have it all their own way. Certainly Sunderland. Yeah, Sunderland was fingertips clinging on for a large period. Hanley and Omobama Daly were excellent that day, but they got the job done, as they did against Swansea. But until I see some compelling evidence in this Carrow Road swing upcoming between now and the turn of the year, or just into the turn of the year, then I can't put forward a case that things have changed now and there is a reset, and all that turbulence hitherto is behind them, and that they can now look forward with a bit more positivity because something's clicked. There's more fluidity. There's more free flowing element to their football. We didn't see any of that at Swansea. So, for now, we're in a holding pattern, I think, and we'll swiftly find out if this is different and if any work they've done over this month-long period, has transpired into something which is a marked departure from what they've served up at Carrow Road. Because, if it's not, then I think this could head south very quickly.
Yeah, I concur. There's been a lot of focus on a quote that Dean Smith gave before the break, Sam. He said that he wanted to see Norwich City return as a different animal. He clarified that a little bit on Friday and sort of specified that he was talking more so about kind of their work out of possession rather than perhaps their general play. Now, whether people agree with that or not is probably up to the individuals in question. He felt yesterday that he did see that from Norwich City, particularly from a defensive perspective. Again, Ben Gibson referenced their defensive structure and how good that was. And there is part of me that does accept that, but also there's part of me that feels, again, that's because of how Swansea really struggled to penetrate them in central areas, how they were pretty happy to play in front of them for a lot of it. But you do look at kind of the XG per shot rate, which I've got in front of me, and that kind of shows that really Swansea had a big chance in either half. The first one that fell to Jay Fulton, I think from a set piece, wasn't it? It was a second phase of a set piece that was caused a bit of a scramble on the goal line. And then the one from Carl Norton in the second half, which probably should have done better at the back post with his header. And beyond that, really, Swansea didn't create anything that was particularly noteworthy. Angus Gunn didn't have to make a tremendously important save to keep Norwich City in it. So do you agree with Dean Smith? Did you see a different animal, a different Norwich City out of possession compared to what we saw before the break, or was it much of the same for you?
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't say that I saw a different animal, and it's a game of opinions. I don't want to criticise Dean Smith too much for that, and I suppose in the opening few seconds he may have seen a different animal when Danel Sinani managed to dispossess Swansea and almost play Teemu Pukki in sort of the first 15 seconds. But I felt what he's talked about quite a lot is winning the ball back quickly, and when he referenced that different animal, it felt to me like he meant more pressing and winning the ball back as opposed to their ability to sit back in their own box and defend balls into it. If that was what he was referencing, and he was talking about an improved ability to sit in a low block and deny the opposition chances, then it probably is a different animal. But all the references he's made so far this season are to improvement in perhaps the final third, when you lose the ball, going back and getting it quicker. And I think across the evidence of yesterday's game, I didn't really see much improvement in that whatsoever. In fact, I thought Swansea's press was quite a lot.
And with that, he's gone. We'll never find out what Sam was going to say at the end of that point. We'll get him back as soon as we can. But Pad, on that point, did you see a different Norwich City out of possession? I mean, I sort of came into this championship season expecting to see a Norwich City side that was probably a bit like what we saw in the opening 2 minutes of that contest. It was energetic. They wanted to press, wanted to engage teams pretty high up the pitch, wanted to try and disrupt what opponents were doing, particularly playing out from the back. Doesn't feel like we've seen that consistently enough. So I think from that perspective, everyone would probably subscribe to the view that they needed to be a little bit better out of possession. Do you feel they made strides in that area yesterday? Were you expecting a little bit more? How would you reflect on their work in that particular area of their game? Well,
again, it's this, the result tells you clean sheet away win that, yes, they achieved their objective in that regard. And you then overlay the possession, overwhelmingly in Swansea's favour. The game overwhelmingly played in the Norwich half. So to walk off the pitch with a clean sheet, they clearly did achieve that objective without the ball. But in terms of different animal, that sort of hints at some marked radical departure in it, and it wasn't that at all without the ball. It was what we've seen in periods of this season. My mind goes back like the first half, for example, against Swansea, where they were capped by that Sanani turnover very early on, which led to a big Pukki chance, which then indirectly led to the next phase of play from the corner where they scored. My mind goes back to Coventry City at Carrow Road when I think Nunes robs Gustavo Hamer high up in the pitch. Ball gets turned over, Pukki goes through and scores. So we've seen that aspect before. That wasn't a radical departure. And equally the second half, which was more, as Sam touched on there, low block, defending the edge of their own box. Well, that was Sunderland, that was Blackpool away from home, which we've already talked about. So no, it wasn't a radical departure. It's elements that we've seen in Norwich's better defensive phases this season. But the nub of the matter is, both with and without the ball, what has been glaringly obvious is they're not able to find that consistency. And by that we mean on occasion, not even from game to game, but within games. The way they lurch from seemingly in control and on top to, conceding the initiative has been a constant theme under Smith this season. So, I'll only buy into an idea that we're seeing a different animal if it's, and I think Ben Gibson touched on this in his post-match interview, if they follow it up with series of clean sheets, one after the other, because then you're building a body of work which does hint at more than we can do it as and when. No, we can do it as our benchmark, essentially. And again, like I touched on earlier, in terms of, until I see a consistent seam of results at Carrow Road, then it's very hard to sort of debate that it's basically more of the same. So, yes, different animal. Well, if a different animal translates into something that we haven't seen before, then no, because we've seen those aspects of their defensive work at Swansea last season, but earlier in the season. But it's the consistency factor now, and if they follow up Blackburn and next at Carrow Road with a clean sheet win, then yeah, you can start to say, okay, maybe we are now seeing tangible evidence of something which is more longer lasting than 20 minutes in a game or even a game itself. So, but I'm sure, and that's worth reiterating. He did also make it quite clear in his post match he wasn't happy with what they did with the ball, and he felt they were too passive in the second half. He's not delusional and thought that was the perfect performance. Far from it. But I think, given post Middlesbrough, he made much play of this work without the ball. He touched on it again on Friday in the build-up. A gripe of his, he used that phrase all season, their inability to press and turn over the ball to the degree he expects or demands. Then maybe overall he had that box ticked against Swansea. But, I think until we see more evidence, then I don't think there'd be too many Norwich fans who would share his assertion that that was a different animal at Swansea.
No, I mean, my fear about that win really is that I've kind of seen it before. I've seen Norwich City win like this before, and it's proved to be unsustainable. It hasn't been something that they've been able to do on a consistent basis, particularly at home, like you say. And that is the fear. Blackburn are up next. They currently sit third in the table. I know that they didn't have a particularly good result or performance on Saturday against Preston. And I know that they haven't drawn a game this season, so they've been a bit all or nothing. So you're not really sure what you're going to get from those either. But the fear is that once they face a team that does have a bit more thrust or is a bit more willing to come up physically against them, which we have seen on occasion this season, that there is going to be a struggle to contend with that still, and that is a real concern. What did you make? Because you were in the room, and there's been a lot of focus on this kind of after the event, and once those kind of quotes were out there of Russell Martin's comments about how Norwich players were essentially apologising to him once they came off the pitch for obviously what they maybe perceived to be, or what he perceived to be, an unjust result because of you basically cut the final third away, and certainly in general play, I think it's difficult to argue that Swansea were the better team, although there's an element of that which, as Sam said earlier, is because Norwich City had something to hold on to, and they were in a little bit of protective mode, so that did probably affect how the game transpired overall. But what do you make of those comments? Have they been taken out of context a little bit? Have they been overrated a little bit? What's kind of your view on that? Because you were in the room when Russell Martin delivered them.
Certainly was. Yeah, I mean, I've just looked. I had a sense that it was the case, but I've just double checked, and they've now gone 6 games without a win in the Championship. So for me, I think that was more for his domestic audience, essentially pointing out that they were every bit as good as Norwich and probably better in many facets other than the one that ultimately mattered, which was the scoreline. And I guess if you're pushing that narrative, it helps to throw in, and I'm not for a minute disputing that there was 1 or 2 Norwich players who probably do know him. I'm thinking the likes of Max. He didn't reference any by name, but I'm just hypothesising that there's 1 or 2 players who were still there, very young, but still there when he was at the football club, maybe in the academy more so than the first team environment. So, I mean, it was noticeable, both Aarons and Liam Gibbs, they were warmly embracing Matty Gill at the final whistle, just in the mouth of the tunnel. So, if you've got that relationship with these guys, then you probably would sort of say, well, we maybe dodged a bullet there today, and then you were very good, your team. And it's the sort of throwaway stuff you would say. I don't think there was some huge mea culpa, and no, we're absolutely distraught to be leaving here now with 3 points, because let's be honest, they were more than happy to get the 3 points, get on the coach, get on the plane back to Norwich. And if you haven't played at your best and maybe you've rode your luck, then probably as a professional, that feels even better, rather than, you've turned it on and you're fully meriting of the results. You probably savour those ones when it's against adversity and you haven't reached your levels, yet you still get the result. You probably feel, well, that actually shows, as Smith alluded to, the togetherness, the spirit, the character, the resilience in a group. So, bringing it back to Russell Martin, no, I wouldn't overinterpret them from a Norwich perspective. I think he was maybe, as I say, off the back of now 6 games without a win in the league, maybe just a message to his fan base to keep the faith almost, and that a team who he feels, whether you agree or not, will be there or thereabouts, with players who are good enough to be there or thereabouts. He felt his team more than matched Norwich. And on another day, they walk off the pitch and they've won the game. So, yeah, no, I wouldn't. Anything that Russell Martin said in his post-match, I would filter through. Ultimately, his priority, as he said in the build-up, it's not Norwich anymore, it's Swansea and the Swansea's fan base. So I'd imagine that's just stick with us. We're doing a lot of good things, and results will turn. And it's worth pointing out, despite them going now 6 games without a win, they're only 4 points behind Norwich. They've had, for the level where they're coming at, where their expectations are, they're probably overachieving at the minute. And it'll be interesting now for me to see how him and Gilly guide that club between here and the end of the season, because there's a lot of good things to admire about the style of play and how they try and dominate games of football, but you can also see where they're falling short, and it's the top end of the pitch and a bit of inexperience and naivety, and that was encapsulated in what happened in the first sort of minute or two, really, which ultimately cost them the game. So, there's some good things happening there, but ultimately, Norwich have far loftier ambitions, as they should do, and maybe it was just that streetwise edge which ultimately decided that contest.
Yeah, I do think we need to be. I've seen this on a few occasions now with various bits that maybe people have jumped on and criticised for the sake of criticising. I get the mood and I get the narrative and why those two things are the way that they are. But I mean, that for me feels like criticising for the sake of criticising almost. I think Norwich, and you say that there is a pre-existing relationship with some of Norwich City's players and Russell Martin, and maybe the extent of those conversations, and we weren't privy to them, so we don't know, may have been overrated slightly. So I just think we have to be very careful with how much we are criticising people for private conversations that we weren't privy to, but also more broadly about jumping on every little thing and maybe interpreting it in a negative sense, which isn't always the way that it's intended. So that's just more of a general point that I wanted to raise. But Sam, you're back with us, which is good. I'm looking at the championship table in front of me now. Burnley are playing as we're recording this podcast. They're currently beating QPR 1-0. Actually, you look at where Norwich City are, so they're fourth at this moment in time. Sheffield United, they won yesterday, did they? I presume they did. They beat Huddersfield 1-0. But the gap now to the automatic promotion places from Norwich, so Sheffield United in second is 6 points currently. If Burnley were to see this out, it would be 9 to the top. Just to put that into perspective, 6 points in the other direction would take you down to Coventry pretty much in 15th. So that shows how utterly bonkers and bizarre this division is at this moment in time. But it also reiterates maybe why there is such a focus on performances and sustainability, because in a championship that's so congested, and it's always a cliched remark about the championship being so competitive, but this year seems to highlight that in the extreme. There does need to be a sign from Norwich that what they can do is sustainable. And I guess that is probably why people are looking at this victory with the performance behind it, maybe than just taking the result in isolation. And it was interesting actually to hear Ben Gibson say that Norwich wanted to play a lot like Swansea do, but maybe I think the phrase he used was, we're not quite there yet. So all of this maybe paints the picture of a team that feels that there's more to come. And probably that's reflective of the season so far, I would guess.
Yeah, and you mentioned that gap to promotion places. It feels to me, when you add to it the inconsistency within performances and from game to game, and the perhaps discrepancy between results and performances at times, it feels very like a team that's going to be in the playoffs. You look at the championship table now, and usually when we get to this sort of stage of the season, 2 or 3 teams do start to pull away. And I'm sure going into it, Norwich would have felt they were very likely to be one of those teams. But for now, it looks like they're going to be one of those sides that regularly impresses and regularly gets strong results, but isn't quite there with the consistency to dominate the division that they have. Both of the last 2 times they've been in the championship, and as you said,
not to interject, sorry, but does that create a different narrative, and do people therefore need to look at what this season is going to be in a different light on the back of that? If it isn't an all-encompassing title win, do people's perceptions and maybe their bars need to be lowered a little bit in terms of what we're seeing from this group of Norwich players?
Maybe in terms of for their own expectations and for themselves, but I don't think there's any need to look at it and feel more sympathetic with Norwich because they haven't been able to pull away. I think actually it's probably more ammunition to criticise them with, because we know there was significant confidence within the club before the season started that they would be promoted. All the pundits outside it had them as one of the favourites, and the squad and the manager and multiple staff all suggest that they're the types of people that should be in and around the top of the championship. So as much as perhaps from game to game it might be better for Norwich City fans' sanity to be going to games thinking, okay, playoffs minimum, as opposed to the promotion, automatic promotion minimum expectation that they had at the start of the season, I don't think we should now look at it and perhaps excuse some of the performances by saying, okay, they're a playoff team, let's sympathise with them and admit that it's not always going to be there, because the fact is that the quality of player at this level is such that it should be them. And the only two teams that I've really seen outperform Norwich, in my view, and the only two games where I've watched them and thought, okay, Norwich aren't really going to get a result here, or Norwich were never going to be good enough, is Burnley and Watford, their fellow two relegated teams. And when they're up there, you sort of have to ask the question a little bit as to why Norwich aren't there. They spent significant sums on players who I'm sure they thought were perhaps even too good for Championship level in the summer, and they haven't been able to compete with those two teams that now might pull away particularly well. So, you know, I do understand that need to manage expectations, and playoffs obviously always means you're in with a chance of promotion. Dean Smith has been promoted through the playoffs before. Norwich have been promoted through the playoffs fairly recently as well. So it is a legitimate way of going back up to the Premier League. But I'm sure had they looked at things going into the season, they would not have accepted that lottery. I think if you would have offered them the playoffs at the start of the season, certainly those within the club wouldn't have taken it. And judging by that measure, you can't really feel too much sympathy for them that they're in and around this situation, to be honest. You have to probably call for it to be a little bit better, and we're yet to see the performances that suggest it might be.
Yeah, absolutely. Pads, I want to talk about Teemu Pukki. It feels like one in every 5 pods we end up talking about him and some sort of goal scoring achievement that he's broken. His goal yesterday means that he's now leapfrogged. That's easy for me to say on Sunday morning, afternoon. Leapfrogged Robert Fleck into 4th in the all-time goal scoring charts. It's now you and Roberts. There's, as I said, there's some dispute. I think we've got him down as having 97 goals. I think the official figures are 96. I'm not quite sure why there's a discrepancy. I think there was a goal that maybe should have been credited to him that wasn't. But that's from Pete Raven, who is our ex-colleague who we trust. So I'm going to stick with 97. So that would put Teemu Pukki 12 behind Ewan. What I wanted to highlight more so is because there's been a lot of talk about him this season and maybe his wavering influence from a goal scoring perspective. But actually, you look at his numbers. So he's now on 7 goals for the season, 4 assists. In 21 games, that would put him at 11 goal contributions. That's still 1 in 2 that he's contributing to a Norwich City goal. Is some of the criticism that's come in his direction, and maybe it's not even necessarily aimed at Teemu Pukki, it's more his role within a system that maybe don't quite match, and that's probably where maybe some of the discussion comes from. But there's no disputing those numbers and his numbers in a Norwich City shirt. If he has opportunities, particularly at this level, he scores goals even now.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that assessment at all. I think, second half, yesterday, second half, he's essentially sat on the halfway line watching Swansea attack versus Norwich defence. What conceivably can he do, when the service is that fitful? Literally 1 or 2 counter-attacking forays in the entirety of that second half. When he cut this league asunder in the 2 previous attempts that ended up in championship title wins, we don't want to labour the point, but he had the framework around him to maximise his natural attacking gifts, namely a player in Emi Buendia who was on the same wavelength and led an enviable cast list of attacking midfield options who could supply Pukki with the type of service he needed. And palpably, he hasn't had that this season, not over the entirety of the season, But I can't really pinpoint any real phase of the season, and that bleeds into the wider debate about Norwich and performance levels and structure and style of play, particularly with the ball. He's now operating in a very different Norwich to Daniel Farke's Norwich, and at this level, Daniel Farke's methods, whatever you think about him in the Premier League, were residually effective, and 2 title wins in 2 attempts would underline that. So, yes, he's obviously not getting any younger. So maybe there's an element of that. Maybe his powers aren't quite what they were. But as you said there, 11 goal contributions in 21, 22 appearances. That isn't a player who's over the hill by any stretch of the imagination. And even the movement, just the trigger move yesterday to get around Cole Norton and anticipate that Kenny McLean flick was going to land in that area of the back post inside the 6-yard box. That's razor sharp anticipation. And there's no doubt in my mind that if you put the right players around him and the right template around him, he still will score you plenty of goals at this level. But, it's all part of the the complex equation that Smith is wrestling with. You know, we've spent however many days since Middlesbrough sort of gnashing and wailing of teeth about what they're not doing without the ball, but with the ball as well. There's plenty of work that needs to be undertaken, and you know, we've had this debate about Sargent or Pukki or Sargent and Pukki, and it's not resolved still. But ultimately, there's two players there who've got 16 goals between them in the league this season, and that's in a side who haven't really dominated enough games for me. So, you know, the potential is there, and he is very much still Norwich's championship spearhead. Yes, Sargent has shown that he's a capable foil, but I still think Pukki is the main man in terms of if you get the right service in and around him. And as I say, you know, they will always have a chance in games with him in the side, because out of nothing there, he's created a goal which has won them a game. When you look at all the other match metrics, they probably don't deserve to win that game. So, you know, while you've got an attacking weapon like that, you know, it's really beholden on Smith and his coaching staff to try and extract far more, because, you know, as I say, get him the right type of service on a regular, consistent basis. If he stays fit and healthy, you know, he's into double figures and a long way into double figures. Whether he quite gets up to Ewan's levels, which would mean another 11 or 12 goals a season, I'm not sure at this stage. But it's not beyond him, put it that way. But you'd be far more confident if you could see an attacking structure that was wrapped around him, that on a weekly basis is getting the most out of him. And, you know, the players are there. You know, Ramsey not available this weekend, but, you know, he's got that in his arsenal. Dowell, Cantwell, you know, all of these players have the ability, but hitherto, Sarah even now is coming to the party in a more prominent way in terms of chance creation. So, you know, there are players in this squad, but it's just another element in Dean Smith's in tray. How do you come up with a system of play that really extracts far more from Teemu Pukki than what we've seen so far, which in pure numbers is a healthy total, a healthy return. But, you know, maybe that's all part of the unlocking of where Norwich's season is going to go. If you could, with the ball, get Teemu Pukki in a system which, you know, furnishes him with far more chances than he gets per 90 minutes, then you might find that goes a long way to moving Norwich along this path to being a far more fluid, far more potent side at this level.
I still think he'll end up as Norwich City's top goal scorer this season by hook or by crook. I think he will still be there. He's obviously not there at this moment in time, but I think that's where we'll end up. I mean, the numbers around his level of performance in the Championship is absolutely staggering. 105 games played at this level, 62 goals, 18 assists. That comes up as 80 goal contributions in 105 games. So that means he's played 25 games of Championship football that he hasn't scored or assisted in. And again, to put that into perspective, 11 of those have arrived this season. So that probably highlights that point that we're making in terms of how the structure around him needs to be better. But he proved yesterday, even when there is a slight opportunity, he can almost, it's that age-old expression that gets used around strikers. He can almost smell opportunities, smell openings, can't he, and manufacture them himself. And those moments that maybe separate the good strikers between the very good strikers, where he can almost sense where a ball is going to drop and ensure that he is in a position to make that a very, very good opportunity. And he still had a lot to do when the ball dropped to him as well, and he lifted it probably a bit more than he would have liked, but it was still a very good finish. And of course, now up to 4th in the club's all-time goal scoring charts, which is some achievement. I also wanted to speak a little bit about Todd Cantwell. Aaron Ramsey obviously missed the game yesterday through injury. Daniel Sinani started on the right. I felt it wasn't really a game geared to his qualities, if I'm being completely honest, but he was relatively anonymous, but again, not helped by how the game played out. But Sam, what did you make of Dean Smith's comments on Todd Cantwell? He said that the pair had a conversation on Thursday. He suggested that Todd Cantwell then requested to sit out of this game, suggesting that he wouldn't be physically ready and would prefer to have a few more sessions at Colney to improve his physical fitness. What do you make of that situation? Because I think there will be some people who will look at this and say, well, Norwich have just had a 4-week break where I'm sure they have had training. He was in Tampa as well. He played half an hour in a warm-up game against Manchester City last weekend. Why isn't he up to those levels? Now, we don't know why that is the case, but what do you make of this? Because there is a perception, a narrative, fairly or unfairly, I think often unfairly, around Todd Cantwell. It's an intriguing one, isn't it? I think if we phrase it like that.
Yeah, you could say intriguing. To be honest, I find it absolutely bizarre, especially given Smith sort of praised it. I think he said it's an attitude he loves. And I can't imagine there are too many managers up and down the Football League that are loving attitudes from players where they don't feel they can be part of a squad going into a big game for them. I suppose the honesty might be a factor for Dean Smith and the willingness to recognise that he has to improve. But for a player who has been fighting against those sorts of perceptions you referenced for a good portion of his Norwich City career, I'm not sure it's a great look, and it is quite puzzling because it's the sort of thing you don't really hear a lot. The idea that a player rules themselves out of contention because of not a tangible injury but a physical fitness issue, and it does feel quite strange. So I don't know where things go from here. I suppose we'll have to track it and see what sort of involvement Todd Cantwell sees in the next few games. But it maybe would have been a more crushing blow and more of a story had he actually had the sort of start to the season perhaps a lot of people hoped he would or expected he would once they saw the signs of a player totally on board and with the enthusiasm that we've maybe seen from him before. We went into the season based on a pre-season where he'd shown a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of hard work, and he was clearly a man with a desire to play a part in this Norwich City team. But a player who's out of contract in the summer and probably is on a little bit of a trial in terms of whether they get a renewal or not, and even if he doesn't want to be at Norwich, he's on trial in terms of what sort of club he now gets in the summer. It seemed like a really, really bizarre decision for me, not only to miss out on that opportunity to showcase himself and to put himself across to Dean Smith and perhaps other clubs as what sort of player he is, but to probably create a little bit of a story around him. And yes, those conversations would have happened behind the scenes, but Todd Cantwell and Dean Smith both would have known that question would have been asked by us when he was missing from the matchday squad. And to perhaps feed that perception a little bit by electing to stay and train, it seems a bizarre decision from me. It seems bizarre to me that Dean Smith is happy with it, and it's a situation I'm keen to watch develop, because there are quite a lot of intangibles in there, as there seem to be across a number of key and quite negative moments in Todd Cantwell's career. So without wanting to judge, without knowing all the facts, it is certainly a concerning development and one that you wouldn't have expected at this stage of Todd Cantwell's career.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, both Cantwell and Pukki, part of 8 Norwich City players, I think it is now, that Kenny McLean signed a new deal, who are out of contract in the summer. You asked, Paddy, you asked Dean Smith the question about whether conversations have been had about extending those, and it doesn't seem like that has been the case at this stage, which is interesting. Of course, those players are free as of next month to talk to clubs overseas about signing pre-contractual agreements. So, again, an interesting situation that you've got such a chunk of your squad with Pukki and Cantwell, players of differing levels of importance, out of contract. So we'll see how that develops. Pad, I thought we'd conclude the pod by speaking about our weekend a bit, because it was an eventful trip to Wales, wasn't it? All told. I guess where do you want to start? Do you want to start in what was it, Reading West service station? Do you want to start with your wake up call in the middle of the night? Which one would you prefer?
Well, I mean, to be fair, the Reading anecdote, you should tell that, Connor, because you nearly got us into a bit of an altercation with some very upset locals. So you tell that one.
Well, to be fair, I didn't even know that was the case. So we've obviously we've gone down on the Friday night. Brazil were playing Croatia, weren't they? It was during that game. I think it was either the end of the game going into extra time or one of the ends of one of the halves of extra time. I'm not sure. Might have been. I think it was the end of the second half, wasn't it? And there's as there is in most service stations, there's a screen up on the wall. People are obviously crowded around that just to watch how the end of that game develops. But to give you an idea of the building, the screen, just to the right of that, there's a corridor that leads to the toilets, which is where I was heading. And I've just stopped very, very momentarily just to look at the scoreline. And it happens, I didn't even realise that I've managed to stand in the way of two locals who were watching the game. And again, I didn't hear, but apparently you informed me there were some comments made about my I'm quite tall, so I understand their frustrations to an extent, but there were some comments made, weren't there, about my positioning. It wasn't necessarily the best.
You were rude, Connor. If you want to be brutally honest, to paraphrase what was said, you were described as very rude, and my concern was that we would end up with police being called because they were quite aggressive and combative. But then the payoff to that story, I think you're right. I think it was towards the end of normal time in a game which went to extra time, and when we were 5-10 minutes further on and ready to depart en route to our base in Newport that night. So, in other words, into extra time, they departed. So I find it quite amusing on reflection that they were ready to have fisticuffs, it felt like, judging by their tone of language, and yet they'd already left by very early in extra time. So I don't think, unless they were rushing home to watch the conclusion because they were disgusted at not being able to watch the television because there was a tall man from Norfolk in their way. I don't know, but so yeah, that was quite an interesting development. But to go back to your other point, yeah, then at our base, unfortunately, it's the time of year now, but we were housed in a wing of our hotel where there was clearly an office party with a lot of the office staff staying the night, and they, shall we say, enjoyed themselves, and to the point where at 2:30 in the morning I get rudely awoken by some screaming women who should know better, because I don't think they were in the first flush of youth, let's put it that way, but and they were obviously so inebriated they would seemingly thought my room was their room, and all I could hear was somebody at the door handle trying to get into my room, which was locked, I hasten to add. So not happy, because then it went on for about 2 hours, literally running up and down the corridor, carrying on the after party. And the upshot was a very disrupted night's sleep. So, yeah, not the perfect preparation. And let's be honest, the way that game panned out, I could have easily fallen asleep in the second half. That wouldn't have just been solely down to the fare on offer. But, yeah, it was. Yeah, and then, of course, obviously then we had 6-hour drive back, interspersed by, sadly, another World Cup exit for England.
No, I wasn't going to mention it. So we went from a position of having to, and I want to say, if they happen to be listening, I apologise for standing in their way. It was an inadvertent error, and it was for literally about 4 seconds. So I'm not quite sure it warranted the response that it apparently got. Not that I heard it, but I can imagine that you were particularly. Well, I'm surprised that you a few choice words weren't shouted from your hotel room. I must be honest at that, because I think if it was me in that position, it certainly would have been.
Yeah, no, I was more, you're in that half, you've been woken with a start, you're kind of in a half sleep state, so you only process it after the event. But unfortunately, I had about an hour and a half after the event to process it, because there was no way you were getting back to sleep. And our colleague Adam Harvey would testify. I think you two gentlemen were probably slightly in a better part of the corridor and didn't really hear the commotion.
Yeah, I was right. I did get a pull on the handle that I didn't process until the morning, until you said, "Oh, they're trying to get in my room." So I think I may have been subject to a very small amount of disruption, but yeah, I was mostly all right.
I don't know if I'm a heavy sleeper then, because I just did not hear it. I think there was I was kind of awoken for about 5 seconds at around 1-ish at some noise, but after that there was nothing. And we weren't a million miles away either. We were kind of if you imagine a big long corridor, there was then essentially 4 rooms, so 2 either side and then sort of 2 centrally. So I was kind of opposite you, wasn't I? And then Sam, you were in the central one that was next to me. So I'm not quite sure why I didn't hear it. Maybe I'm just a really heavy sleeper and I didn't know, which is a possibility. But there we go. And then of course, Pat, since you mentioned the World Cup, we then have a really bizarre situation of obviously missing that game, which would have been the case for a lot of Norwich City fans who travelled to South Wales yesterday. I'm sure they would have been huddled around smartphones or around the radio to listen to how that unfolded. But we essentially reached the service station that we stopped at. It was still 1-1 at that point, wasn't it? And we went in. Then Olivier Giroud's goal happened, and then England were awarded the second penalty, which Harry Kane missed. And there was a radio that was in the services, but it was about a minute behind what was actually happening. So we were obviously refreshing social media, knowing that stuff had happened before we were hearing it on the radio. And I think we managed to dart back to the car to listen to Harry Kane missing the penalty. It was quite a bizarre way, as this whole period has been, quite a bizarre way to consume a World Cup quarter-final.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, I wasn't aware that Giroud had scored because
no, you weren't. Yeah, I remember that conversation actually.
I thought that was a penalty to put England 2-1 up with about 2 minutes to go. So it was only after he'd missed it, then
so it was like a double hit for you then, wasn't it? It was like a punch to the face and then another one soon after.
Yeah, I think I can only assume that at the point where Giroud scored, I'd departed to the restroom and missed it, but. Yeah, no, it puts me in mind that I was saying this to, I'm not sure it was, it might be Phil Daly from Radio Norfolk, but it's the second time I've been working when England have been at a major, when they played Germany, I think it was 2010, the Lampard ghost goal. That was a Sunday afternoon from memory, and I was actually covering the Norfolk Amateur Golf Championships. Prior to, I was distraught that I was going to be, no offence to the Norfolk Amateur Golf Championships, but I was... the prospect of England-Germany in a World Cup knockout phase game. But obviously the way that the wheels came off there, I was quite happy to be on the 16th following round, whoever. It's that long ago, I don't remember. But I thought you two and Adam took it in your stride, because I was saying to my wife this morning, funny enough, when I was in my early 20s, whenever England used to go to major tournaments, it used to cut me quite deep. But I think with the passage of time, you get used to the disappointment. But I was half expecting you three to be almost inconsolable, but it wasn't the case.
I was a bit gutted at the opportunity, the lack of an opportunity to enjoy a semi-final with friends. But other than that, I don't feel like it's one of those things. England, I don't care enough to. It's one.
And he's gone again, so we'll never finish that sentence. But I think for me, he's kind of, it doesn't become a shock anymore, does it really? I think you get to this stage and pretty much every major tournament that I've seen in my life, this has kind of happened, with probably the exceptions of the Euros last summer, where obviously they reached the final. But even then, that ended in disappointment. So I think for me, it's just, I reflect on it as a bit of a shame, because the way the tournament had transpired, and obviously it's now Morocco in the semi-finals, it felt like they had a wonderful opportunity. And actually, I think the winner of the World Cup will come from that tie. So I think France will probably go on and win it now. So that's probably the major frustration. But if I'm honest, and I said this to you guys traveling up, I didn't think there was a lot between the teams. I think that probably came through in the game. But I probably expected France to edge it. So maybe it's an expectation thing that you kind of expect it. And then when it happens, it maybe it doesn't affect you too much. And I think probably the fact that we were listening to it on a radio probably added some distance, maybe. I'm not quite sure. But to go back to Norwich, Pad, Blackburn at home next weekend, it's actually poised to be a really interesting game, because you look at where the two teams are in the table. Blackburn obviously in third, as I mentioned, Norwich in fourth. There's a point difference. Blackburn on 36, Norwich on 35. So it is really an opportunity for Norwich, providing that Watford don't win their game in hand, because they've got a better goal difference than Blackburn. But it would essentially mean that Norwich leapfrog Blackburn by a couple of points. But obviously, if Blackburn were to win, that would then push them 4 points ahead of Norwich City, which at this stage of the season would just add a distance probably between Norwich and those at the top of the division. So it does feel, probably from Norwich's case, more like a must not lose. But I guess then you add in the context that we spoke about earlier about their Carrow Road form and the fact it is at Carrow Road, there will be an expectation on them to win. So how do you see this one playing out, and also the importance of the fixture more generally?
It feels like a big one, yeah, for the reasons you've set up there, the proximity of and if to sort of develop a little bit the chat we had earlier about, is there a lowering expectations now, almost imperceptibly, and it's a playoff sort of horizon as opposed to automatic. That's not definitive, clearly. The amount of games left would indicate that they're still more than capable. But if it is the lesser of those two bars that they need to clear, then you're playing a team with one place and 1 point above you. It's big. It's big. And they will be smarting, to lose 4-1 at home to, I guess you'd call them a Lancashire rival in Preston, another team who are in the top six as we sit here and record this. No doubt Thomason will be seething with that result and want a response. So, and they have goals in the team. Brereton, Diaz, he's the last 2 seasons, he's shown himself to be a very effective force at this level. It looks like they're building something there. So, yeah, I think this is going to be a very intriguing game. But for all the reasons we've talked about in this podcast, Norwich have to put their best foot forward. They have to win this game from their own point of view internally, and for their fan base to give them a belief. So they haven't beaten anybody in the top 6. Am I right in saying, Connor? I don't think they have they?
Let me just have a look. They didn't beat Watford. They didn't beat Preston. They didn't beat Sheffield United. They didn't beat Burnley. Correct. So Blackburn, only team left to play of the current top 6. But that statistic is correct. Yeah, as things stand.
And ultimately, it's not definitive. But if you're not able to beat any of your direct rivals, then it doesn't bode well moving forward. So again, on many levels, the victory with a performance that merits the victory, I think, can really inject some go forward into what's to come. And conversely, if it goes the other way, then sadly it's going to, I think, subject Smith and those players to even more criticism, more scrutiny, and more questions. And the only way that they stop, and the only way that a lot of people who still, the jury's out, and maybe others who have harder assessments of Smith and feel he's maybe ran his course, the only way that changes is consistent run of results and performances, and particularly at Carrow Road, where hitherto they've not cut the mustard. And to do it, as I say, against a Blackburn team who you think by this stage of the season, you can probably say with a fair degree of certainty they're not going to fall away, so that they're going to be up there for the remainder of the season, there or thereabouts. To get the win over them and play well into the bargain, I think that really would feel like a step forward for me, with another 2 out of the next 3 at Carrow to come as well. So, yeah, this does feel like, for many reasons, because fundamentally it's only 3 points at the end of the day, and it's we're not in late April, and it could be the deciding factor. Far from it, but given all the disjointed nature of the season to this point, to follow up what they did very well at Swansea with a more polished, more rounded performance with a win against Blackburn at Carrow Road, then maybe we can start to see a bit more light at the end of the tunnel, and even the ones who are in the Norwich fan base who really are not having Smith and this group of players at the moment might be willing to maybe soften their stance a little bit. But it's all very well talking, and I'm sure Smith will say the right things in the build-up, but fundamentally we need to see a step forward in terms of with the ball, and maintain what they did without the ball at Swansea, because I think Blackburn won't be as compliant, even though they're coming off the back of quite a heavy defeat for them. That is a bit of an anomaly in terms of their season as a whole. I don't think they'll come to Carrow Road and roll over. They'll probably come to Carrow Road and relish it and look at a team who have struggled to impose their authority at home and think, if we can get into these and they expose that kind of vulnerability, get the fan base against this team, then there's a result here for them. So it's a really intriguing game in prospect, and it's a big game for many reasons, and we're getting to the point now where Norwich do need to deliver. Smith needs to deliver. It's not enough to kick the can down the road and say there's plenty of games left, plenty of points left. Fundamentally, if this season is going to chart in the positive trajectory we all hope, you need to start putting something sustainable in place beyond 20 minutes in a game, 1 game, 2 game spell. It needs to be. I mean, I had a look there earlier. The last time Norwich won back-to-back games in the Championship was mid-September. We're getting on for 3 months down the track. That's nowhere near good enough for a team with aspirations to get back to the Premier League. So when they've got an opportunity this weekend coming, they need to take it.
Absolutely, and we'll be at Carrow Road, of course, to bring you all the updates, analysis and reaction from that game. Plenty of content across our channels in the week coming up as well. There'll also be a special podcast with former Norwich City manager Martin O'Neill at some point this week, which is going to be an excellent listen, I think, for people of that era, and particularly those who remember his managerial spell and maybe reflect on it with a bit of what if. But that does us nicely. Pad, thank you very much. Thank you to Sam as well, who's still not been able to rejoin us, but thanks to him for his contributions as well. Thank you all very much for listening, and we'll see you all again next week.